Next, we're going to talk about the recycling of matter because, like we've seen in the food chain, matter keeps flowing through the system. It ends at the tertiary consumer. However, the matter even comes back and goes through as a decomposer and it gets recycled. We're going to look at different ways some key elements and key materials get recycled through the biosphere or the ecosystems. So we have to remember energy is constantly being added by the sun and it's being released by the ecosystem through all the organisms using the energy, whether they need it to grow, whether they release it off as heat, it's always being cycled through. The sun always provides us constant input, so matter needs to be brought back from the dirt and needs to be re-put back together so it can be in a usable form. This is the biogeochemical cycle. So bio, life, geo, earth and rocks, and the chemical cycles. And so we're going back and cycling all of this together. We're going to focus on these four main cycles. The oxygen and kind of carbon cycles are sort of tied together, but there's these four main cycles we're going to look at: the water, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen cycles. We're going to look at one of the easier ones to start with, the water cycle. Real simply, it evaporates from large pools of water, it condenses in clouds, it precipitates, meaning it's some kind of water falling, whether it's rain or snow, and then it collects again. Or trees can collect it, and what it's called when trees essentially breathe out moisture is transpiration. Just like how we kind of breathe out and there's moisture on our breath, trees sort of do the same, but they get rid of excess water in their system through transpiration, and then it all collects again. Quite a simple cycle. As we're going through the water cycle, these key terms, condensation, precipitation, evaporation, transpiration, all need to be known quite well, and you should be able to draw out a water cycle using these appropriate terms, no problem. Now we're getting into a little bit more complex, and maybe we haven't quite studied them, but when we look at them, we're like, oh, right, kind of just makes sense about how we have carbon cycling through our environment. And so we can see through carbon, it is getting pulled up by producers and it's taking it in and creating these simple sugars. And then we have primary and we have higher level consumers eating it. They breathe it out in the form of CO2, and then plants take back in that CO2 and then recycle the matter on the very simplistic terms. So we're starting here, we cycle up, and we breathe it through, and we create a very simple carbon cycle. What we've seen though with our geology unit is sometimes this matter goes down, it gets stored, and it gets kind of put into just other hydrocarbons, and then it went up and it would burn through fossil fuels, and then we get this CO2. Or we can also have just different deuteriuses, and they are used as plant nutrients, and then it's also released as well. Here are the keywords for the carbon cycle. Hopefully we remember the formulas for photosynthesis are CO2 plus H2O. And so these are the key ingredients for every plant to grow. And what they make is O2 plus simple sugars, or C6H12O6. And what we see from this and what we've learned is the exact opposite is cellular respiration, where it takes these sugars and oxygen and we would breathe out CO2, and there is a little bit of water moisture on our breaths. Other ones, carbon sinks and combustion, we all know and we've studied from that last unit. The oxygen cycle is very closely tied in with the water and CO2 cycle because, well, CO2 has oxygen carried with it. Water has oxygen carried with it, but this O2 is very important because we need that O2 for combustion or cellular respiration. And so this oxygen cycle is its cycle on its own, but it's very closely tied with the water cycle and CO2 cycles, and we can kind of see some of the overlap of key terms. So make sure we're going through the same points of the oxygen cycle, and think of the oxygen cycle when you're studying the carbon and the water cycles, because the carbon sinks are the oxygen sources. The fires remove the oxygen from the air, or its cellular respiration removes this oxygen from the air. And then oxygen can also turn into ozone, which is kind of like the Earth's force field we learned about. And then finally, photosynthesis helps return said oxygen back to our environment. Lastly, we have the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen makes up 78% of our air that we breathe. For us, it just doesn't react. It's inert and we don't really use it. We just breathe it in, we breathe it back out. However, this is one of the key ingredients to helping plants grow. Just like how we grow and we can't just live off of sugar and oxygen at the basic level, that's for cellular respiration, but we also need vitamins, we need minerals, we need other well-balanced nutrients. Same thing for plants. They don't just live off of CO2 and oxygen. They need vitamins, they need nutrients, they need minerals to actually help live. Nitrogen being a very, very big one. And so what we have are these organic residues or this organic matter, and we might see it in the form of things like ammonia right down here. And cow produces a lot of it and it has this organic matter, but then we need it to actually be broken down and we need this bacteria to fixate and to have this nitrites and nitrates to actually be used for plant consumption, or it needs to kind of get lost and it gets back as gaseous losses, and that's what we see in our atmosphere is just a bunch of nitrogen. But very, very key for helping plants grow strong. Here are the key words for the nitrogen cycle. I talked about nitrogen fixation, so this is converting that gas into that ammonia, and it's done by this bacteria in the soil. We have nitrification, converting the ammonia into NO3, so it can actually be absorbed. And then denitrification is the opposite of nitrification, and it's converting it back into nitrogen gas. And so this is also done through denitrifying bacteria. So it's good to have a healthy soil that can actually do all of these things. So what are the practice things? We have to understand how all of these cycles individually work, but also understand that all of these cycles are part of this larger ecosystem and why these focused cycles are so important to ecosystems. Lastly, we're going to look at biodiversity and humans. And why is it so important to have this biodiversity and why humans really affect this? So you think about it, humans change the environment to meet our needs. Cities do not just naturally occur, we've changed it. This would lower biodiversity. So quickly, remember biodiversity though is the variety of life in all forms. And so when we look in a city, there is just not a lot of biodiversity. It's hard for things to actually grow on asphalt and concrete. We plan to have plants and backyards so we can see life still. However, we have a tough time looking downtown between all the buildings and the roads to actually see biodiversity in life. So what we do is we need to make sure that we have ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity, because just having all the same things in a locked area doesn't really work well for populations. Or having species, having them diverse, it's breaking apart these food webs, and we're starting to see the things we're learning about now coming together and the problems that we have. So one of the problems that we have is habitat fragmentation, where we're breaking apart habitats because we want to build roads or we want to build cities, but we're putting them right near places where animals can't really traverse or fit in that well. And so it just makes tough for the natural environment to cope around us. Another example is when we go through national parks and we see these massive roads cutting through. And this road, well, it breaks apart and now there's traffic and these animals get hit by these cars. it's gone to so far that hopefully we tried to fix it with these big land bridges that fit over top, and that way species of different deer, wolves, different animals that live in the natural forest can actually cross the road essentially without causing traffic interruptions. As you can see here, look at the farmland. It makes it very tough for animals to actually traverse it. Works well for our agriculture, but it really is hard for animals like this to move across or escape predators or just to get around, because even having a simple barrier as a fence makes it hard for animals just to freely roam. Seismic exploration we learned about in geology, where we needed to search for oil and gas reservoirs, and we need to make sure that we're not really affecting predator and prey. However, cutting across large segments of land and just upsetting the natural cause of things can be very tough. Another issue with reducing biodiversity is habitat destruction. One example we see here is just logging, and we need wood and we need to have all this building materials. However, there is now, as we're discovering, better ways than just clear cutting and taking everything right back down. Now there's a lot of different strategies put in, like selective cutting, and not just destroying the environment, but selectively picking out the old species and helping the new ones grow into it. Finally, another example of how humans cause reducing biodiversity environments is introducing invasive species. And this can be things like plants, or it could be animals of species that don't necessarily live in that area, but when they're introduced, they thrive and they actually outcompete all the other things. You can think of it in your backyard when you have weeds. Those weeds or dandelions, they compete the natural grass, and soon, if you just leave it, you'll have a backyard full of dandelions. Other ones you can have is something like a zebra mussel. They just outcompete things and they just grow, 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 and there's no competition because nothing actually eats them. So they have no competition to, or no predators after them, and then there's no competition for food, and they outcompete everything that is natural or was just there before. Lastly, here are a few practice questions to make sure you work through. Please make sure to go through your work booklet. There's lots of information here, but please make sure to take time to go slowly through it and answer all the questions through the workbook. Take care, and please don't be afraid to ask questions.